G'day everyone, my name's Ebony Bennett and welcome to the Australia Institute's webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I know it's a little bit later than usual, but one of our guests is joining us from London today, so we needed to shift the time there. My name is Ebony Bennett. As you know, if you've joined us before, I'm the Deputy Director. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. It's Ngunnawal country. It's been a glorious Canberra day here in Ngunnawal country today. And I acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and pay my respects to elders past and present. During the pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly, but days and times do vary as the time has varied today. So make sure that you're subscribed or just check out our website to see the upcoming webinars. You can find them at tai.org.au/webinars so that you don't miss out. And just a few tips before we begin to help make sure the webinar runs smoothly today. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function. You can type in your questions there. You should also be able to comment on other people's questions and upvote them if you think they're good questions and you'd like me to ask it in the second half. There is a chat function. A couple of people have told me they find that a bit distracting, but we like the debate. So we're going to keep it. If you click on the chat, it pops up as a separate window and you should be able to minimize it or move it to the side of your screen where hopefully it's less distracting. And please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or Noah will boot you out. We haven't really had many problems with that, so hopefully we won't today either. This discussion, lastly, is being recorded and it will be posted on the Australia Institute's website and emailed to you all in the next couple of days after this discussion. So today I'm delighted to introduce our three guests. Dr. Robert Elliott Smith is an AI expert and author, a technologist, complexity scientist, entrepreneur, writer, and public speaker. He's the author of Rage Inside the Machine, The Prejudice of Algorithms and How to Stop the Internet Making Bigots of Us All. And he's a senior fellow of the Computer Science faculty at the University of College London, where he co-founded the Centre for Decision Making Uncertainty. Clare O'Neill is the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Technology and the Future of Work, as well as the member for Hotham. Clare was elected to Federal Parliament in 2013. Her electorate of Hotham in Melbourne's southeast stretches all the way from Mount Waverley in the north to Springvale in the south, and it's home to over 130,000 people. And it's one of the most diverse electorates in Australia, with 35% of residents born overseas. Clare was appointed to the Shadow Ministry in 2016, later appointed as Shadow Minister for Financial Services in 2018, and since July 2019, Clare has been the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Technology and the Future of Work. And you might have heard her on Radio National Breakfast. I think it was this week that I heard Clare. And Peter Lewis, lastly, is the Director of the Australia Institute's Centre for Responsible Technology and the Executive Director at Essential Media. He's also the author of Webtopia and the creator of the Australia at Home series in partnership with The Guardian. And I'd like to hand over to Pete now.
Thanks, Ebony, and hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. You know, anyone that knows me knows that one of the upsides of this terrible year has been the opportunity to connect with people and share ideas. One of the big ideas for me this year was actually the last time I think it was out in public before the lockdown. It was the WOMAD Festival in Adelaide, and I was invited to be on a panel talking about how tech was changing the public square and the way that we treated each other. And we were in this amazing event where there were musicians from all over the world. And one of the thinkers that was invited was Rob Elliott Smith, who'd written this book that I hadn't heard of at the time, but of course I bought on the day, called Rage Inside the Machine. And it's a revelation in terms of a technologist talking about the political economy of his work, and I'd never come across anything like it. And I've kept in touch with Rob since, and I've been really looking forward to an opportunity to share some of his thinking with an Australian audience. And so tonight, I'm really excited to have Rob here to walk through some of his thinking. I'm also really grateful to have Clare here to share her experience and perspectives on what I think is a new idea. So the short version is, in his book, Rob talks about the edge of chaos, which sounds really
we might have
evolutionary biology. Oh, sorry. Am I still there?
Yeah, you're back again.
So the idea of the edge of chaos is an idea rooted in evolutionary biology, challenging orthodox views of technology, economics, and the democratic process. So I think this series is a great forum to explore some of this thinking and maybe also inform our response to this remarkable moment in history. So what we're going to do tonight is let Rob talk us through the theory, and we'll kick it around a little bit. And then I'm going to bring Clare into the discussion to think about how some of these ideas might help us think through, I think, from the progressive side of politics, how to deal with this particular moment we're in. So firstly, Rob, hi again.
Hi.
I think you've got up early.
I have indeed, yeah.
So do you want to start just by walking us through the edge of chaos, the theory for a dummy like me?
Okay, it's really simple. So this is more modern thinking on how evolution actually works. So when Darwin sat down and wrote Origin of the Species, his context was not just biological. There was a context there of that had existed since his grandfather's time of social evolution, and people believed in social evolution, what we now call social Darwinism. And so in that context, he came up with his theories, but he was very gentle in the way he wrote about them. In the first instance, he wrote about the idea of natural selection, exploiting the diversity of populations to advance biology and adapt to conditions. Then what happened was Herb Spencer, who is kind of called the father of social Darwinism, thought of this phrase, survival of the fittest. And survival of the fittest came along and became the way that people sort of think about evolution. In particular, Darwin liked the phrase so much that in the 5th edition of Origin of Species, he included it himself. And Darwin was a bit of a social Darwinist himself. And so the theory of survival of the fittest is effectively that evolution acts to promote the best possible things. Now, best possible things doesn't have a real meaning in biology. And where this came from really was the idea of people wanted to look at society as an evolving system. And to some extent, what they were trying to do is argue that the reason that you had an English empire that the sun never sat on was because the English were the best, right? It's effectively was a bit of a racist theory. And there's plenty of signs of racism in early biology. So more modern theories of evolution look at it slightly differently. First of all, in any moment in evolution, you don't get the survival of the best, because what the best is unknown at the time, and whether it exists over any period of time is not clear. What you get is you have a diverse population that's diversified by random effects in the environment. It could be anything from a neutron hitting a gene to dry and wet patches on a surface, dry patches having one condition, wet patches having another condition, and that causing different things to happen to the morphology of a creature. So effectively, you have diversity. So that the nature tends to diversify for various physical reasons that are complicated. But then you've got natural selection, which essentially means that only some people get to reproduce because some people starve, so some creatures starve. So you get these two pressures, diversity and natural selection. And what they do is they collide and they lead to an equilibrium. Now that equilibrium is what a lot of modern biological theorists call the edge of chaos. On one side, you'd have maximal diversity, but no structure. On the other side, you'd have no evolution. So you get stasis, death, effectively. So effective evolution exists at this edge. And one of the characteristics of this edge is you have as much diversity as you can have while having structure that allows you to use that diversity to adapt. And one of those structures, there are a lot of them in biology, but a prominent one is recombination. So you have the ability to take this diversity and through structures that exist, mix it together and find good solutions. Why is this a good thing for evolution? It's what makes evolution effective, because the phrase that people who have edge of chaos theory background say is it maximizes the adjacent possible. So you have this ability to basically, if things change, and they always do, we live in a radically uncertain world. When things change, you can move to new conditions along that edge very effectively. And that's a powerful thing to be able to do, to evolve and adapt. And evolution does adaptation. Now, sitting that in the larger context that I know you want, Peter, is that is not to say that all natural systems that change effectively exploit the edge of chaos effect. For instance, I worked in evolutionary computation, which is an artificial intelligence technique that exploits mechanisms like evolution, that look like evolution. Well, in algorithms. Well, people who do that work know you've got to very carefully tune your parameters, because you need to stay at that edge of chaos. Because if you don't, you get ineffective operation of the algorithm. So you can construct artificial systems that evolve ineffectively. For instance, economics. We've all been schooled in an idea of economics that says, let the market be completely free and it will optimize social effect. Now, clearly, we know that isn't true. That's why we have governments that act on the economy, that try to make the economy balanced and effective and fair. So you can have an evolutionary system that's ineffective, or you can have an evolutionary system that's effective. The measure of that effectiveness is how close it is to the edge of chaos. Now, that kind of thinking needs to be used in economics, it needs to be used in society, and it needs to be used in the algorithms we use to, the algorithms we are now putting in our infrastructure of how we all basically live in the world. So I hope that's a big picture.
No, that's a really good big picture start, because it seems to me that so much of our notion of development and human advance is based on that idea of survival of the fittest. And so many of the projects, whether it be economics, whether it be technology, whether it be politics, it is to advance. And the advance is almost this arm wrestle where the strongest survive. What you're saying is that the stronger systems have noise on the edges to give it room to adapt to unforeseen events. And it makes me think, for instance, of the stress that was placed on, supply chains during the sort of first wave of the pandemic. Sure. So it does take a different way of looking at an economic model, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But if you build that in, it's going to not be something that looks quite so elegant, but with space on the edges.
Well, I'll give you an anecdote, and I got this from Gerd Gigerenzer, who's somebody everybody should check out, a great writer about various things, about the way the brain really works, about the way evolution really works. But he said that he found instances where Germany had been criticized for not optimizing precisely its the availability of ICU beds. So it was well known that Germany had, in quotes, too many ICU beds to optimize their healthcare system. Well, those came in handy because the radical uncertainty, having flexibility, having built in some room for variability in the way the system operates, that diversity was exploitable when a radical change occurred. Likewise, supply chains, very just-in-time supply chains, have been massively disrupted. Supply chains that have some flexibility, that have dual sourcing, that have the opportunity to be flexible, have survived more robustly in the face of the pandemic. This is the reason we have to have this diversity of structure, so that we can move to other structures effectively as if we were on the edge of chaos. When we design economic or political or informational systems that don't do this, then we have a problem. And I think we see that problem, and I know you want to talk about this at some point, in the way media distributes information to us all now, because it's not designed in a way that affords mixing.
Well, maybe a great example of the brittleness of information systems in public discourse was on display for us at 11 o'clock today. I know for you overnight with the presidential election, where we're almost at the end point of the perfection of delivering of content to different tribes that want to see the world differently. I know you've done some thinking about how you could adapt this algorithmically to create a bit more of a sense of chaos from the perfection.
Absolutely. And it's an interesting progression of events. Of what's happened is effectively we have the the neoliberal economic theory that is effectively built into everything we build infrastructurally. It's built into the way we distribute information, because effectively information is distributed in the way advertising is distributed, because advertising drives effectively the economics of information distribution. And the way it's done is basically through segmentation, categorization of people, and the targeting. Now, when you do this, and we've done some simulations of this, when you do this in a social media setting, what you end up with is polarization of information and the echo chamber filter bubble effect. And that's a natural effect of the way we've built the system. The system is not built, it's built around this idea of personalization, optimizing for you personally. You could change the word personalization to targeting, right? Targeting is a more precise word of what's being done. That targeting effect has led us to a system where we have diversity, but no mixing. And diversity and mixing together are the key to staying on this edge of chaos. So if we were to design our systems where we promoted the idea of a diversity being delivered to everyone, and then them being able to being encouraged to more effectively mix their ideas, then we'd have a much more effective evolutionary system. And there's good science to try to do this. It's not just airy-fairy stuff. There are scientific ways and algorithmic ways we can try to make systems work this way. However, given that our informational systems are driven purely economically, it may require something besides pure economics to make that happen.
Yeah, I can see in the chat that the comment that Facebook is not going to embrace a system that takes away from the potency of its targeting engines, but you could imagine a social network for a public purpose that actually built in diversity of views into somebody's user experience, yeah?
Yes, definitely. And if any of you have watched the rather excellent documentary, The Social Dilemma, that's now on Netflix, it's all industry insiders from the informational infrastructure of our world talking about how things have gone dramatically wrong. And at the end, the end bit, when they ask everybody what to do, almost every one of them says regulation, regulation, regulation. But what they don't say, and they're right, but what they don't say is that the regulation needs a framework, and it needs ideas behind it, right? And it needs new ideas. And these ideas that we're talking about, the edge of chaos ideas, are a good starting point for thinking about how do we create social media that's well regulated and effective and delivers good social rather than personalized effect.
Clare, I'll bring you in, and thanks for joining us. I'm interested in your reflections on Rob's overview, but particularly, I guess, the notion that effectively the parameters of technology need to be designed by policymakers rather than just sort of be driven by a market impulse.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Peter and Robert. It's just, I loved your book. Really great to be speaking with you this evening. So Peter, I guess, you know, it's important to me in these conversations that we acknowledge up front that there are some very important social benefits being delivered by technology around the world. And we sort of focus a lot of the public conversation on the things that aren't working well, but let's also acknowledge that, you know, some of the technologies that Robert's written about the most, you know, artificial intelligence and machine learning and these things, they have enormous potential to deliver public benefit. I don't think they're probably doing as much of that as they could be at the moment. And I want to actually mention some of the reasons why I think that's the case. There is no question that there's incredibly damaging things being done because we're not adopting sort of more creative models to how technology is being developed. Robert mentioned some of the issues around, you know, the American election. A lot of Australians, I think, feel they're watching a failed state, you know, as we've watched coronavirus sort of rip the US apart, and now the election's just unbelievable sort of crumbling of what was the greatest democracy in the world. And I have confidence that things will get resolved and it is going to be okay, but it's quite a what not to do, really, right there for us all to see. I feel, you know, I've really experienced that deterioration too in the time I've been engaging in politics. And some of the things that worry me a lot are not just the issues around fake news and some of the trends that are associated with that line of thinking, but it's the way that behavior online is bleeding into real life exchanges between people. So we hear more and more about family members that can't speak to each other, you know, lifelong friends who have fallen out because they've got a political disagreement. And I think that sort of sets a banality about the online dialogue and the way it's being driven by, you know, the silos, the fake news, the combination of all these things is actually deteriorating something that as humans we've spent thousands of years trying to build. So this is why, you know, these things worry me so greatly. So what do we do about these problems? As the Shadow Minister for Technology, I spend quite a lot of time thinking about it. The first thing I'd say is there is no policymaker in the world that knows the answer to this right now. And I follow the kind of leading global thinkers on this issue. We're all kind of casting around, trying to find not just the technical solutions to the small specific issues that we see, but actually higher up, what do we need to do about these problems? One of the things I just want to put on the table is this question about what's driven the development of technology up until now and how that may change. What I mean is, you know, if we look at some of the online platforms that I see are doing the most social damage, and I think about Facebook and its impact on democracy, I think about things like Tinder and Grindr, the dating apps that all the young people use, and the incredibly concerning changes to how relationships are working now as a consequence of what those platforms do. Let's remember that those platforms were designed for some pretty crappy reasons. Like, remember Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook because he wanted to rank his female classmates in terms of who was better looking. And, you know, Grindr and Tinder are about, no offense, but a bunch of dudes who wanted to find ways to hook up with people more easily. So is it any wonder really that those platforms have developed in ways that are causing enormous social damage? So what I want to put to people is that, you know, the way that we think about the role of government in technology, I think deserves a real systemic rethink. Basically, policymakers in you know, democratic countries like ours have basically stepped back and said, we're in a capitalist economy, we let the private sector develop stuff and we let it run because we want to see where it's going, and that's human progress, perhaps justified. But basically the role of government has been, let's try to sort of shave off the sharpest edges and stop people, you know, recruiting terrorists on Facebook and stop people abusing children and that sort of most egregious things. But what I want to ask is whether there's actually a role of government here to actually drive the development of technology itself. Why is government not much more involved at the very beginning of how these things start, so that at the start, the values and the principles that underline how technology develops are actually ones that citizens decide, not Mark Zuckerberg and not a bunch of, you know, shareholders that live in different countries. So I think there's enormous potential here for us to think a little bit more laterally about this. If I can just give you one more example and then I'll pass back to Robert. There is a government in the world that's taken a very different approach, and it's not something that we'd be following, but the Chinese government, for example, has been intensely involved in the development of technological platforms. Now, of course, they have very different goals as governments to the ones that we have in Australia as in a democratic country. But I think it does show that if you have the will, you actually can shape the way that technology is used by people for the public good. Our public good just looks a little bit different to theirs.
We've spoken about this a bit in the past, Claire, and it hasn't delivered, but the process of getting the public on board with the app for the corona was actually interesting in that the government needed public buy-in, so they actually had a conversation with the public on what the design principles would be. So I guess what you're proposing is something much more ambitious, not dealing with a particular piece of technology, but dealing with how do we make technology work for a liberal democracy, and how do we create effectively, I guess, design principles before we start having the rollout of the next beta model. Yeah,
exactly right. And you know, the COVID safe apps are really sort of interesting example. And Robert, I'm not sure if you probably didn't follow this debate, but we had a contact tracing app effectively created by the Australian government that they really pushed, but ultimately not enough. The app didn't work. Not enough people bought in, and it never really went anywhere. And basically, a total waste of money and waste of time, which is very regrettable. But one of the things that's really interesting about the way technology is developing is that governments just are much more careful about how they use technology. and they're asked permission usually, and that they're usually trying to follow the rules. So what you find is that Facebook, because they never asked me about what they were going to do with my data, knows enormously personal things about me, but the government can't get a medical health record off the ground. So the public benefits of all of this technology are really being hampered by the fact that we've basically got all these rules when government's using data and AI, which is a good thing, but the private sector can use it in whatever way it wants. And they're amassing these data sets that basically mean that no one else can come into their market because they're so incredibly valuable. So we've basically got it all wrong, and how we're sort of thinking about setting the ground rules, you know, for public and private use of these technologies.
Yeah. You know, I think in history, as new technologies come along, they shock systems and how to, and technologies like, for instance, steam, being able to basically make a vehicle go 30 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour. God, and you saw in the early days of automotive technology, you saw rules that were just absolutely ridiculous that basically impeded the technology so completely that it was unable to advance. And that happens, right? Because governments don't know how to deal with new technologies. In the philosophy of today, and I do try to set this in the context of philosophy. In the philosophy of today, we basically have a philosophy of hyper-individualism and market economics that is really primed to all of world culture now. Just world culture is primed with these ideas. But the thing is that those ideas are not a road to perfection. And any engineer, I'm an engineer by background, any engineer will tell you, you don't design an airplane based on a philosophy. You don't say, I'm going to make every system in an airplane hydraulic. Because if you do, then if you got something wrong, everything fails. So in airplanes, you'll have triple redundant systems where one system's hydraulic, one system's electrical, and one system's mechanical. And it's done intentionally. And the reason it's done with different technologies is for diversity, because if one of them fails, you rely on the other. So this principle, this philosophy of diversity is a different way to look at how we should build our systems. And governments, I think, in catching up with the technology, have to realize this is what's gone wrong. The path that's gone wrong is the idea that market forces will make everything work. And they won't. Market forces are useful, but they're not the only thing. And we need to basically create a system that has appropriate balance of regulation and network and market effects. And that can be done, but first we have to embrace a philosophy of basically diverse ways of doing things, right? That we need a diversity. Right now, every social media system is driven by advertising. I mean, that's the only way they're driven. If we could just have some input that basically said, okay, social good, you talked about social good should be a value in media. Now, when radio came along, we regulated, there was something in America called the fairness doctrine. So they came in and basically said, monopoly effects, somebody could buy up all the bandwidth in a local area and dominate the political messaging. And because of that, they came up with the fairness doctrine and said, look, bandwidth, limited resource, we've got to have fairness. In the 1980s, under Reagan, an idea came along that said, wow, bandwidth's really expanded because we've got cable television, and soon after that, the internet. Bandwidth's so big now, we don't have to worry about the internet. Let market economics take care of it. So they eliminated the fairness doctrine and said, the market of information will take care of providing everybody good information, because only the good information will survive, survival of the fittest. That's not what's happened, obviously. What's happened since the 1980s is effectively fragmentation of the media landscape. And effectively, without regulation, what you end up with is everybody having an individual truth. Well, not everybody really. Different groups of exploited people having different informational truths that then benefit people who exploit the flaws of that system. So social good has gone away because of a shift in philosophy. And I think if we embrace a philosophy that says in society, to have effective evolution, you've got to have diversity, cognitive diversity, informational diversity, diversity of people who design systems. If we adopt that as a philosophy and then regulate around it, we can have media and informational systems that benefit society rather than causing it to fragment.
And it's kind of interesting, isn't it, after 50 years of Friedmanite thinking that the government needs to get out of the way, this is actually an argument to regulate in the interest of more stable systems, which is a new way back into the notion that government has a role to play in life.
I agree. Yeah.
So, Robert, can I ask you, from a policymaker to a philosopher, computer scientist, etc., many other exciting things in your title, I'm just interested, how do you see this idea being actually converted into public policy? I completely understand what you're saying. It makes total sense to me, and especially the sorts of things you're talking about with, requirement to present different points of view and that sort of thing. Just what do you think governments should be doing at the moment about these issues?
Yeah, I think that there has to be, well, I think that Australia is doing some very interesting things. And it is interesting how nations now, I think the character of nations is becoming about how do they interface with globalized technologies and corporations. That's what the character of nations is now. And in Australia, the things you're doing recently about Facebook, Google, Twitter, about the media companies, that's a pretty good trick that you're basically saying, now you have to pay for the traditional media. But I think on top of that, they have to have responses to social good. I think we have to, first of all, see that Facebook, Twitter, Google, all of these information providing entities are media companies. They're media companies. They're not technology companies. They're media companies that use technology. Airbnb is a hotel company, and Uber is a taxi company as well. We have to see them for what they are, and then we have to regulate them appropriately. And in the media space, what that means is basically saying media has a social responsibility, and it has to be able to demonstrate that it is actually generating public good. That it is that was a response in the fairness doctrine. Part of the fairness doctrine was broadcasters had a responsibility to the public good. Now we have media companies that have no responsibility to the public good. The only way I can see, I'm not a policymaker, the only way I can see that happening is for it to be a public mandate, for people to say, these companies that provide our information and are infrastructural, they're private infrastructure companies. We wouldn't build public infrastructure that wasn't in favor of the public good. But our infrastructure isn't built by the public, it's built by the private sector. And what we do is we regulate the private sector to say you can't dump lead in the drinking water, you can't pollute the skies, and and I think you can't basically create a media system that demonstrably, both in empirical and analytical experiments, causes political discourse to collapse. So I think it's about regulation.
Yeah, I might interrupt there and we might go to questions from the audience now, but I'm going to exercise my prerogative as host and ask a quick one first. We've talked a lot about some of the failures of the private sector, and I think Claire raised some really great examples about why Facebook was created in the first place and where, no surprises, where it ended up. But government, particularly in Australia, we've had some really recent examples in Australia of government using either AI or machine learning or technologies in ways that actually didn't do the public much good. We had a scandal called Robo debt where, huge numbers of Australians that actually owed no debts to the government were really punitively pursued, told they owed the government thousands of dollars when they in fact didn't. And that was all based essentially on an algorithm. So I guess, could you address with that idea of the public good, and then we might come to you after this, Claire. It's all well and good, and I'm absolutely for government intervening to regulate, but there's limits to that as well. And the government also has to operate in good faith and with the public good as its center, and it doesn't always.
Yeah, the thing is it is a changing culture is hard. So having been a small business entrepreneur myself, a culture changing business is not a good business because it's so damn hard to do. But the thing is we do have to have a bit of a change of culture, because at the level of government, at the level of the commercial sector, and at the level of the general public. There, we have an idea of hyper individualism and market forces that is deeply ingrained. And I'm not, I'm not saying all of that's wrong. That stuff works. It just works in limited ways. And we need to have to realize that it does, because if you haven't, one of the reasons that America is so dysfunctional is the most hyper individualistic culture in the world. There's a great book by Kurt Anderson called Fantasyland, which I recommend to everybody to understand America. And it's about hyper individualism. That hyper individualism is now a part of our information infrastructure. So we have to have a shift in this philosophy away from hyper-individualism towards the idea that it's a balance. It's an edge of chaos. You need a balance between the effects that benefit the individual and the effects that basically diversify and randomize and make things random. That balance has to be struck. So I think that's what I was trying to do in my book, is try to promote that philosophical shift. Without that philosophical shift, the thing about evolving systems, I'll try not to go on too much. The thing about evolving systems is I believe they always do get better. And you do, even a system that's off the edge of chaos will jump to the other side and then try to equilibrate back to the edge of chaos. So I say about the future, it's not a matter of whether things will get better. It's a matter of whether we have to go through Mad Max to get there first.
Well,
Yeah.
We've got, I think, about 670 people on the line with us today. So a really big response here. Before we move to the first question from the audience, Claire, just quickly, I'll come to you. Does robo-debt give you much confidence, for example, when you hear that the government's now thinking about introducing facial recognition to access welfare?
Yeah, really good question, Ebony. Very glad you asked it. I mean, I feel like I could honestly not be much more harsh on the way that the Australian government's used technology. If they wanted to have the goal of reducing public confidence in what all these changes mean for us, then this is the strategy to adopt. Just about every major shift on tech policy that's happened has either been essentially a catastrophic failure or has, one of the sort of core principles of all this stuff is meant to be do no harm. Well, robo-debt was incredibly harmful. Tens of thousands of us, the most vulnerable people in the country, got these nasty letters from government demanding money that wasn't even owed to many of them. And of course, we know now that it was illegal. So yes, I definitely agree with you. And I do think that, as we look to the future, technology is not just some issue on the side that affects little bits of what government does. It is increasingly everything. It is part of everything we do. So I just say to you, I don't think we should accept that because of robo-debt and because of the COVID Safe app, the government can't do technology and that everything it touches that relates to technology is going to fail and that it's a lumbering prehistoric mess that can't properly engage with these topics. I think we need to push and ask our government to be better, not to stop trying to engage. Think of the e-health record. Like, that's a failure that doesn't get a lot of airplay, but what horrible damage it's done. We could be doing so much more with the data of Australians to help them be healthy, and we're failing because the government sort of stuffed up the rollout of it. So I just say, I just really push back on anyone saying that government is incompetent at dealing with these things, and that's a fundamental characteristic of government. We've got to believe that government can be different, and maybe it's different structures that we need to engage with issues like technology that are really fast changing, that require a lot of expertise that's probably not held in-house. But I really believe that we can't just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, we're just going to tinker at the edges here. I think we need to do better and do more, and it just means rethinking how we're working with tech at the moment.
Thank you. The first question I've got here is from Ian Paulin, who asks, how difficult is creating policy settings and agenda setting when the community and the government may be some of the smallest voices in the conversation? First to you, Robert. Obviously, Facebook companies like that are huge, multinational.
Wow, give me the easy question first. I think what we're looking at there is the biggest struggle of our times. Actually, is that effectively the strength and size of globalized corporations is greater than that of governments in many ways. But having said that, there are governments fighting the good fight. The EU is doing some great stuff with regard to trying to regulate technology. They're trying hard, and they need to be supported. Australia is doing some good stuff, so there is pushback against the power of technology. Of course, there is also the possibility of grassroots efforts of people. There are lots of organizations around the world now. I just became a trustee of an organization here in the UK called We in AI, which is going to be a consumer advocacy charity to try to promote better AI in society. So the people can do things too. It's a fight. What can I say? The power of globalized power is a problem. And if I had the solution for that, I'd like to hear what Claire has to say about it, because I don't have the solution for that immediately, obviously.
Claire?
I think you missed one of the most difficult aspects of this, which is that these are global companies, and the regulatory power of, no one's got actual regulatory power completely over any of these organizations. And a lot of these companies are based in the US, where we've had Trump in power for the last 4 years, who, of course, is not of the mind to do anything about these issues. So I think that's the thing that I spent a lot of time thinking about as an Australian policymaker. What can we do from here to protect our citizens and to try to make a change? So just one thing I would mention, though, I don't think we should be totally doom and gloom focused here, because things have actually changed quite a lot. Like, this is moving so quickly. Facebook's only been part of our lives in Australia for just over a decade, and think of how much it's changed, profoundly, the way that we live and the way that we exercise our rights as citizens. I remember when, 4 years ago when Trump was elected, Mark Zuckerberg came out right after the election and said, misinformation on Facebook's nothing to do with us. We're just wires and a platform, and it's not our responsibility. Well, no one would say that now. And in fact, a lot of the tech, CEOs and that sort of thing are very acknowledging that they need to be better regulated. So I think change is coming, and we're in a particularly bad patch here where the power of these organisations has lurched forwards, and governments haven't quite been able to work out yet how to fix some of the problems. But I'm just fundamentally optimistic about these things. We've dealt with monolithic capitalist companies, the East India Tea Company. Like, this has happened before, and we do get there. It's just that sometimes it takes a bit of time between the development of the technology and government's regulatory response.
Pete, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, look, the only other point I'd make is that the power of these companies, particularly your Facebooks and Googles, is the network effect, which is all of us together. And it's not that we do have a level of agency if we choose to use it. And I think part of the political project, and part of, I think, I'm not pretending many people are going to engage in this particular conversation, all due respect to all of us, but, getting the social dilemma onto Netflix and then getting those ideas into popular culture. My kid downstairs, who's addicted to games, is now running a game to hack into Facebook to expose all the data they're collecting, and just slowly building into the cultural conversation that we are playing on platforms that don't necessarily operate in our interests. And then start building alternatives so the cost of moving from these existing platforms aren't as strong. That's the other part of the politics that we can all play a little part in.
Yeah, I think that's right, Peter. But if I could just say a couple of things. These platforms are addictive, and they're designed to be addictive. So I don't think it's a matter of just sort of us waking up and realising there's damage being done and switching them off. The other thing is just the network effects. We've all invested in getting on the one platform, and if I'm not on the platform, I do get benefits from it. I've got lots of friends overseas, for example, and I get to see, them and interact with them. So I think the power of consumers here is very difficult, because they are so dominant, these companies. So, yeah.
The next question I've got is from Ken Coghill, who says, to what extent do decision-making techniques like Citizens Assembly UK and other forms of civic engagement facilitate forcing to act at the edge of chaos? First to you, Robert.
Oh, well, that's a great question. I think that a diversity of decision-making entities is one of those diversities. Remember, the two things you got to have is you got to have diversity and mixing. So effectively, I've been involved in a lot of organizations that try to do social good, and sometimes they become talk shops inside themselves, and it's like argument. Academic organizations are the worst, where they just, it becomes some house where everybody's arguing with, and no effect on the outside world. So you need organizations that do things differently and that use different decision-making methodologies, influenced by different cultural backgrounds, which it's very interesting to look at the decision-making of technologies, decision-making systems of other cultures, because they're not all the same as ours. Having those acting is very important, but as a closed shop, that they don't influence the world. So you've got to have this diversity of ways of doing things and the mixing. So we need to any organization that forms to basically decide about things a different way needs to interface with existing systems effectively, so that those ideas get mixed in. We're not very good at that. And I think that there are lots of grassroots organizations that do a lot of good, but sometimes they become insular and don't have effects beyond their own boundaries. And so remember, it's diversity plus mixing to get to the edge of chaos.
Claire, did you want to add anything to that about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. And, when we're sort of thinking about tools to ensure that the development of technology aligns with our values, I really probably couldn't think of anything better than getting citizens together to discuss these things. And by the way, I think sometimes those citizens will come up with answers that those of us on this phone call probably wouldn't agree with. I think a lot of people who are not heavily engaged in this conversation actually have quite different attitudes. And the example I'd give there is just about data. Robert, you mentioned that in the EU, they've been doing some really cool stuff around data rights and making sure that Europeans have control over who's got their data, where it's going, that sort of thing. And one of the issues they're having in the moment is not many people are using the right. Like, all these people campaigned for years to make it possible for it to be done. And it's extremely important for a small group of people. But a lot of the public are just like, yeah, Google, Facebook, I actually don't really care that much. So I think getting citizens involved, you can never go wrong in a democracy doing that. But yeah, just make the point that people who are not super into this, they actually have their own attitudes, and a lot of them are a little bit more laissez-faire than probably we are here.
Yeah.
I'm just going to pick up on something. So we've talked a little bit about, and I'd like to end on a more positive note. So this is a bit more dark before we get there. But Robert, I was going to ask, the title of your book is fairly provocative, I think. And we have seen that in things like AI and facial recognition technologies that because they're programmed by humans, they often come with the biases of and prejudices of the humans that program it. So, for example, facial recognition technology often has trouble with black and brown faces and recognizing people of color because white people programmed it. There's been a lot of work done on, because men design a lot of things, it really excludes or doesn't think about women. I think the health app on Apple, for example, had no period tracker, which was something that
it didn't even mention menstruation is existing. It was
exactly those kinds of things. I guess can you just expand a little bit more on that and how things are set up and end up with these problems because of the prejudices of the humans who program them?
Well, it's slightly worse than that, because the way I think about it is this: people need to realize that artificial intelligence is not like human intelligence in very deep and meaningful ways. And that's a big part of what my book's about. It's very simple-minded in many ways. It can be very fast and very vast, but ultimately AI is really quite simple-minded. And we see this prominently in facial recognition. What facial recognition does is it reduces your face to a set of blobs and then identifies those blobs sufficiently to say those blobs are this person. Well, the reduction of faces to sets of blobs and noting the color, shape, and texture of those blobs, and then using that to identify people can be useful. We all kind of do it in our brains, but it also carries with it the idea that you're basically tying color, texture, and shape to lots of momentous decisions, like should someone be approached by a police officer. And you know, that's the essence of prejudice, isn't it? Is simplifying people down to appearance features and making profound decisions about them. That's the essence of prejudice. And the thing is, because algorithms are actually quite simple-minded, they have a tendency towards biases, and those biases oftentimes align with traditional prejudices, traditional human prejudices, because of issues of design, issues of data, yeah, and lots of choices that get made. So my real effort here is to make people realize that to get away from the AI hype and realize AI, though very powerful and very useful, is not like human intelligence and has flaws. And those flaws can very easily turn into the kind of social flaws that we see in bias and prejudice. And there's interesting historical alignments there that I talk about in my book.
Claire, do you have anything you want to add to that?
There's, you know, horrifying examples of all of the things that Robert have talked about there. They do tend to be happening in the US. I don't want to be picking on Americans, but, you know, people being arrested on the basis of facial recognition, held for 30 hours and on no basis other than a photo kind of looked like their driver's license. There's another really concerning one. I know they've got in the US where judges are being provided with AI generated recommendations about whether to keep people's likelihood of reoffending after they've offended. So you can just imagine all of the difficulties here. I think one thing I'd add is that one of the most concerning things about this is that AI decisions are they're not transparent, by which I mean we cannot even fathom how the computer generated the answer that it gave us. So right. That is a fundamentally unjust way of making decisions. And it happens with some of the examples I talked about, but even things like Uber drivers, Deliveroo drivers, they don't know why they're ranked in the way they are. They don't know why, you know, Joe versus Claire is getting this job or that. You know, it's an inherently unfair way of decision making, basically. So I don't know, you know, no one really knows what to do about that right now. But increasingly, decisions around the world are being made on this basis. And where do governments sort of engage? Other than I just say, you know, just one quick for people's interest, you know, something that governments I think have started to do around the world is regulate principles by which they want AI to be developed, especially when it's being used by government. So justice and fairness and transparency are obviously things that underpin that. But that's just government. And we know, of course, the big problem at the moment is in the private sector.
That's a really good point about accountability and transparency and the just opaqueness of not knowing how those decisions are made. I hadn't thought about that.
Sure.
So we've probably only got time for a couple more questions. Here's one that's a bit more upbeat from Michelle Smith. Is our future the survival of the friendliest? How do we make these things more friendly?
Well, that's a great question. You know, the thing is that if you think about survival of the fittest, think about market economics, you think about these things, they're very focused on the competitive. They're very focused away from the cooperative. And when you've done stuff like I've done in analyzing evolutionary algorithms, you realize that the competitive effects are much easier. The maths are easier. The cooperative effects, the innovative effects are much harder to analyze. So our 20th century philosophies are all focused on ideas of competition, right? They really are. But the reality of what makes ecosystems and human beings more effective is the cooperative. The cooperative is very important. It's the mechanism, it creates mechanisms by which this diversity gets mixed, actually. Think about the simplest cooperation we can, falling in love with another person and having a child. You know, that is a cooperative act. So both parties take a sacrifice through it. But what do they get out of it? Well, they get to propagate their genes, but I think we make too much out of the propagation of genes. What they're also doing is creating society and creating happiness, right? And one of the things I go on about a bit is the kind of competitive reductionist way of looking at things treats human feelings and human ideas as if they're just an illusion. They're an illusion created by physics. That's really what the physics is doing is it's trying to do survival of the fittest, right? But they're not an illusion. Our thoughts and our feelings are real objects. and the real objects that our world is made up of. And those real objects are important, and what we do to make them better is important. So the environment through which we create happiness and friendliness and make that survive and thrive is just as important as anything else.
Claire, did you want to add anything?
I do. We're talking optimism. I'm here for it. The first thing I think I just want to mention is that we're dwelling on a lot of the issues, but remember here that, you know, the great thing about technology is it makes people easier to find each other. And for people who, you know, are suffering from a rare cancer, you know, for every one of them now there's a Facebook group where people are going through the same thing. For, you know, women with fertility issues, you know, anything that you want to, that's happening to you in your life, there's someone around the world experiencing the same thing, and now you can do it together. So there's something inherently kind of beautiful about that, isn't there? And then the other thing, we've got to deal with all these problems, but let's not lose sight of the fact that there are good things here, and we want to elevate the good things and deal with the bad things. The other thing I just mentioned, you know, always in these conversations, I think one of the great transformations that occurred in the 20th century was the feeling that humans are connected wherever they are in the world, and whatever the color of their skin and whatever their human experience. You know, it was when we were, you know, 115 years ago or whatever, people didn't think about other people in other countries as like them. They didn't care in the same way about what happened to them. And, you know, globalization, for all the crappy things that it's brought us, it changed that fundamentally so that we feel a connection to people as people. And I just believe that that idea is going to continue to develop and grow. And so whatever happens with technology, it's going to have to fit away around that. We're going to get over this horrible period, and, you know, what's happening in the US and to its democracy is such a sad story. I think policymakers and citizens all over the world are watching that and thinking, how can we stop that happening to us? So yeah, I think there's a positive thing that's going to happen here. We've just got to ride out this difficult period.
Well, we might end on that positive note. Thank you so much to our three guests tonight, Dr. Robert Elliott Smith, Clare O'Neill, and Peter Lewis. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us and for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but it was hopefully a good discussion that covered a lot of ground. And don't forget to pick up a copy of Robert's book if you can find it. Pete, do you want to just hold it up for us again there if you've got it, so people know what to look for?
I think you can even Google it.
Excellent.
Yeah. The audiobook came out. The audiobook is now out too, by the way. It came out yesterday.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely look that up so I can listen to it on my morning walks. Please, if you enjoyed tonight's webinar, please join us for some more exciting webinars over the next few weeks. If you have enrolled, it's not too late to enroll if you haven't. Tomorrow will be our first Economics Academy webinar at 2 p.m. with Richard Dennis. And I might just say a word on that. We talked a lot about competition and the market here. The economics is the science of the efficient allocation of scarce resources, Richard Dennis tells me, but he notes that we don't always, or firstly, that doesn't mention anything about fairness, but that we don't always allocate resources efficiently. For example, after the World Wars, we decided as a community that we didn't want to just allocate healthcare based on whether people could afford it, but to extend it to everyone. And we certainly don't make those decisions in emergency rooms. That's just a taste of some of the economic analysis that I've done a poor job of explaining there that you can get at Economics Academy. So please sign up at tai.org.au and make sure that you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Stay 1.5 meters away, wear a mask if you can, reach out to your loved ones, keep washing your hands, and stay safe out there, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ebony. Thanks, Robert. Thanks,
guys.
Peter. See you guys.
That's great. Thanks, everybody. It was great.